It's interesting that I think you've seen some interesting patterns with is when I think about Neolithic farmers, for example, I think about okay, farming means food surplus, means more people. So you've got people living in proximity to more animals, and that with that comes the possibility of intestinal parasites, other infections, more people, which means another route for infections because higher population density means easier transmission, but also more people means more potential mating opportunities and with that sexually transmitted disease. And you've seen some interesting patterns in your data. What have you noticed there when it comes to intestinal parasites and diseases and STDs?
Yeah. I mean, it was a huge, generally, the general notion was that real, you can say, epidemics, in terms of, you can say, real pathogenic epidemics, first occurred, around the medieval times, right? That was the general notion that you had the Black Death and, that pestis infections, and it was really based on one written records, and then the assumption that you needed fairly, as you said yourself, fairly dense populations, right, for pathogens to spread in an epidemic manner. And then basically by chance, that's when we discovered, that the teeth are carrying, these infectious diseases, right? We could see that during the Bronze Age, right, 5,000 years ago, you had a massive plague epidemic, right? I mean, we had 10%, around 10% of all the skeletons we looked at were infected by pestis, right, with the bacteria that creates plague. So you can say it seemed, and now we even have evidence of plagues happening earlier than that, right? With the farmers, there's also coming some plague epidemics. So you can say the whole story of disease and spread of disease has been important way earlier than what we thought, and has probably been a major driver of many of these migrations that we see, happening back.
You mean people probably did a lot of moving to get away from
Yeah,
disease and things like
to
that?
get away, right? And also you had probably almost entire populations dying out locally, right? Either
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
fleeing or they're dying out, new land becomes available, other people are getting into this, and this becomes this, you can say, particularly during the Bronze Age and after the Bronze Age, becomes this huge melting pot, right? Where people are moving, east, west, south, north, and creating, you can say, a world where, as I said in the beginning, that the world we are a product of today genetically is very young, right? I mean, is something that was established very, very late in our history. So I think these, in terms of you can say the role of pathogens and diseases has been much more pronounced, if you want, earlier, even in prehistory, than what we previously thought.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you don't need to live in a city of millions of people for pathogens to spread easily. It's much smaller
No,
than that. Yeah.
yeah, it seems to be you don't it, and also the way they spread, right? I mean, the general notion at the time was that the earliest type of plague was the plague that was spreading, from by fleas, right? Biting fleas that bite humans. And what we could see is that the earliest form of plague and pestis is really the one that is spreading through saliva and blood directly from human to human, right? And or
Hmm.
from animal to human. And then, but there's no flea. And then we can see in around the mid-Bronze Age, right? Some 3,000 years ago, that's when the bacteria get the mutation that allows it to survive in the flea gut, right? So it blocks the gut of the flea becomes more and more hungry, and then it's biting and spreading. So a lot of, you can say, the assumptions we had about these diseases completely changed. We could also see, a thing like hepatitis B, right, which is a sexual transmitted disease today, There's hundreds of thousands, I believe, dying from it, millions being infected every year. When we started this kind of work, there was people who believed hepatitis B have only been present in Europe for the last 500 years, right? When we then started looking in the old ancient skeletons, we find it almost 5,000 years back in time, right? So, and when you then take these strains and you look, at how do they resemble present day strains, it completely changes our conception of mutation rates, right? So all the mutation rates about these pathogens that people were working with was based on modern strains, right? But the modern strains only is a tiny, tiny subset of all the strains that has been in the past. If you add those, right, the whole mutation rate changes, and it's really fascinating because it gives you you can say it gives you really a roadmap in terms of what part of a pathogen, of a given pathogen, what is a super variable region, right? What is very conservative regions that could be target for development. It gives you, you can say, it gives you actually a very strong indication of how these pathogens will mutate in the future, right? Because when you get the genomes, these were the ones that back in the day, this combination of mutations was successful, right? Was a successful pathogen. And if it's and therefore it becomes only a matter of time, when will these mutations reappear, right? So you can start testing, well, do our vaccines actually, can they handle, these mutations that were in the past and likely will reappear, etc. So it's quite useful.
One of the things that characterizes modern day Europeans is the light skinned phenotype. When did that first emerge? How quickly did it spread? And what was what was the adaptation? Was it vitamin D related? Was it something else?
Yeah, exactly. So it seems like it's coming. I mean, the hunter-gatherers, as far as we can see, were very dark-skinned and had these blue-gray eyes. And, even when the farmers start moving up, they had lighter skin than those, right? And then you had, of course, Yamnaya, the Bronze Age Yamnaya coming in also with light skin. And you can say the general notion
that was how long ago? Remind us.
that's so the farmers start moving in around 10,000 years ago, and the Yamnaya, the Bronze Age Yamnaya, it's 5,000 years ago,
Okay.
right? So, and you can say the general notion is that it's due to vitamin D, right? That you are basically better at producing vitamin D from sunlight. And I guess there's some argument there in the sense that when you look at the skin color of Neanderthals from Europe, they also seem to have light skin, right? So it's kind of an adaptation to that. But it's something that is coming very late in our history. I mean, the first
You're less than 10,000 years.
Yeah. And for most parts, it's really within the last 5,000, right? So it's something which we haven't had for a very long time now.
Yeah, so something like that, so a very morphological trait like that can spread in 5 to 10,000 years. We talked earlier about lactase persistence. I think my interpretation of the lactase persistence phenotype is we're almost watching, even to this day, the spread of that. Like it's still spreading through populations. It's only partially reached fixation.
Yes.
When you think about the time periods that you study, 5, 10, 20, 50,000 years ago, when you think about the rate of change that you've seen some of these selection events happen in, what does that tell you about sort of the general speed of evolution? Because I often get the impression that people think evolution is much slower than it actually is, and that we haven't been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years and things like this.
Yeah. I mean, it varies, right? I mean, I don't think you can say that there's, one speed or I mean, it varies due to the selection pressure, right? I mean, so how important is it if you want for your survival and reproduction, right? But it can go incredibly fast. And I'll give you an example of this, right? So we did a study I had a PhD student who did a study on you can say, on a group called the Banjo from Southeast Asia, which is basically a group of people who live their entire life on the ocean or in the ocean, in the water, right? So they are known as incredible free divers, right? They are basically, they can keep can be on the water for a very long time, etc. And she wanted to investigate whether some of these adaptations were genetically, right? So not only physiological adaptations, but whether there was genetic adaptations. And the general notion is that this type of lifestyle have only existed for 1,000 years, right? And me and the other supervisor basically said to her, well, we think it's a very risky project. We don't think you will get anything out of it because 1,000 years is way too little time for selection to act on this, right? And well, she decided she wanted to carry it out anyways. And she measured the spleen size, which is where the red blood cells are stored, right? And they had like 50% larger spleen size than the ones living in the closest relative living on land. But then we saw massive selection on genetic variants involved in spleen size, in the diving response. That's when we get water into our face, our blood vessels will retract, our spleen will pump out, and so forth, red blood cells, etc. So within 1,000 years, this group had just been under massive selection pressure. And then she interviewed some of the old timers, right, of these Banjo people, and asked, how can it be, how can you have such a selection pressure? And they told her in the old days, when a baby was born, right, they basically took it through a rope underneath the boat, right, and up again. And some of them didn't survive, right? Some of them survived,
Oh,
right?
wow.
And if this is true, I don't know whether it's true, but of course, if this is true, it's a massive selection, right? It's just
There's nothing faster than that. Yeah.
no, there's nothing faster than that,
Forced
right? So
selection. Yeah.
exactly. So in other words, selection can happen, and not only the selection, but also the spread, if you want, the segregation of the selected variants, right? That's important to say. It's not only the selection, but also the segregation can happen incredibly fast, right? In some cases, and so I think some of the lessons, at least that I have taken home from our work and other people's work in this area, is that first of all, this idea of, for example, in Europe, right, that you people say, well, we are very special. There's even people in my country making these claims. We are very distinct from everybody else, and we have our own culture, and it all developed, and forget about it, right? It's a very recent history, and we all share it, and things like skin color and so forth doesn't matter. I used to, before I did this type of work, when I saw somebody on the street that looked different from me, I kind of thought, oh, they are very different from me. Today, I kind of, well, it's a close relative, it's like, it's like a cousin, right? I'm meeting a cousin here. So we, because of this history where we have moved around, mixed with each other, split out again, brought with us cultural changes, etc. We are one big family. That's clear, and the world we live in is very recent.
How different? Like how would I ask this? Like if we looked at your genome or my genome, and we compared them to each other, and then we compared them to some of those early people that eventually gave rise to all Europeans from tens of thousands of years ago, how different would each of us be genetically?
We would be, you and I would be very similar, right? You and I would be extremely similar, most likely, because when I look at you, we're both Europeans, I guess, originating from Europe. But if you go back in time, it actually changes quite substantially, right?
Mm.
Because if you take a hunter-gatherer, you and I would be, we would have some Yamnaya in us. We would have maybe some farmer and some hunter-gatherer, right? And depending on where we are from, let's say if we both are from Northwestern Europe originally, well, we would have a lot of Yamnaya, right? Less of the others. While the hunter-gatherer back then, right, have the hunter-gatherer, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So yes, I mean, all humans on Earth today is quite similar. That's the first thing I want to say, right? We are very similar, but there would be substantially more differences between me or you and one of these hunter-gatherers than there would be between the two of us, right?
I see. That makes sense. And I'm trying to look for like an anchor point or something that we can use as an analogy. So if I think about something like domestic dogs, right? So humans domesticated dogs. I don't even know how long ago that was. Probably in the last tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, it's around probably. It's also hard to say, but I would say between 10 and 20, right?
Hmm.
Something like that, right?
So if you compare like a dog, a domesticated dog to a wolf,
Mm.
is that like how does that distance compare to the people that came out of Eurasia that populated all of Europe? If we compared
Mm.
us to them, is it like that different?
Yeah,
Is it
it's
more? Is it less?
it's a really good question. I'm actually not sure in terms of you did the analysis how it would come out, but I would say that if you look at, I mean, if you kind of look at a tree, right, of European populations. If you imagine that, on top of all the branches, right, you have the present day Europeans, right, how they are related to each other. And these early people coming out of Africa, entering, you can say Europe, etc., they would fall totally basal on you can say on the chunk of the tree, right? I mean, so they would be clearly separate, right,
Mm-hmm.
from all of us today, right? So but it's because you can say we are even within Europe. I mean, because we today are a mixture of these three migration waves that came into Europe and had, of course, similarities to each other, no doubt, I mean, genetically, but still were distinct from each other, right? They were distinct from each other. They had lived in a reasonable amount of time in some degree of isolation, right? And they are then distinct. They're coming together, blending with each other in different ways. So, of course, the you can say these blended individuals that you and I are deriving from, are different from each of them that are non-blended, right?